The sight of these piggy banks would bring back a lot of fond memories where in our childhood we were always told that if you put in money into a piggy bank, it will grow. So let's look at these two cases. There are two piggy banks and there are these two people. This piggy bank belongs to a person A, where the person A has put in 1 rupee into the piggy bank to start with, and this piggy bank belongs to another person B, where this person B has put in 500 rupees into this piggy bank. Now what these two people do is that person A on a daily basis will put in enough money to double the money in the piggy bank. So right now there is 1 rupee in the piggy bank, and this person on day 1 now will put in 1 rupee so that the money becomes double, which means it becomes 2, and on the second day will put in enough money so that the money becomes equivalent to 4, and on the third day it will become 8, and so on. So person A in his piggy bank will double the money every day, and person B in his piggy bank will put in 50 rupees every day. They do this over a 10-day period, and then at the end of the 10-day period they compare the money that exists in their piggy banks. Who do you think has more money at the end of 10 days? Person A or person B? This is our topic, this is our session on interest, and we'll go through a few concepts of interest and then see whether person A has more money or person B has more money at the end of the 10-day period. What is interest? Interest basically means the extra money that you would either earn or you may have to pay depending on whether you have invested money or you have borrowed money. So interest in very simple terms can be explained as the extra money. Now there are two kinds of interest that we will consider. The first is what is known as simple interest, and the second is what is known as compound interest. Now the basic difference between the two is that in simple interest the principal does not change, which means the initial money that is either invested or borrowed, it does not change over the entire time duration. Whereas in case of compound interest, the principal, which is the initial money, keeps changing because the interest regularly is added back to the principal, and hence the principal keeps changing. So the basic difference between simple interest and compound interest is that in simple interest the principal remains the same for the entire time duration, whereas in compound interest the principal changes regularly because the interest is added back. Now let's look at a few formulae. When we look at a formula for simple interest, the formula is PNR upon 100, where P refers to the principal, which is the initial money, N refers to the number of years, which is basically in terms of the time period, and R refers to the rate of interest, which is expressed in terms of % per annum. So when we use this formula, we actually calculate the value for the simple interest. But now if we want to hence calculate with the interest what is the amount, then the formula for amount would be the initial principal plus the simple interest, which would mean principal plus PNR upon 100, which is the formula for simple interest, and hence amount can be expressed as P into 1 plus NR upon 100. P is the initial amount, which is the principal. SI is the simple interest, which is either earned or that needs to be paid, and amount is the final value that a person will earn or will have to pay, including the principal and the simple interest. These are the formulae that we need to use for a simple interest situation. If we now move on to the compound interest situation, where we've already discussed that the phenomenon of compounding means that the principal keeps changing. Now if we have to look at the formula that we write is directly for amount, which is given as P into 1 plus R upon 100 the whole raised to N. Once again, P stands for the principal, R stands for the rate of interest % per annum, And n, we cannot call n as the number of years anymore. We will have to refer to n as the number of time periods. Now why are we saying this? Let's look at a principal of 1000 rupees and let's look at a rate of interest of 10%, and suppose we use what is known as annual compounding, which means interest is calculated at the end of the year and we want to find the amount in such a case at the end of 2 years. Then the value of amount would be 1000 into 1 plus 10 upon 100, the whole square, because there are 2 years where compounding is done at the end of every year. On the other hand, if instead of compounding being done at the end of every year, if compounding was to be done at the end of every 6 months, which is also referred to as half yearly compounding, then my interest would be calculated every 6 months, and hence if I now want to find the amount, it would be 1000 into 1 plus, it would be 5 upon 100, because interest is calculated every 6 months. The rate was 10% for the full year, so it would be considered as 5% for half a year. And now when I consider n, which is the number of time periods, in 2 years there are 4 6 month time periods, and hence the value of amount would be calculated as 1000 into 1 plus 5 upon 100 raised to 4. Just to repeat, R is considered as 5% because we need to calculate R for 6 months, and N is taken as 4 because in 2 years there are 4 half year time periods, and since we were to calculate the amount at the end of 2 years, N is considered as 4. This is the reason why n should never be referred to as the number of years in a compounding situation. We should always refer to n as the number of time periods. So this is the formula for amount in a compounding scenario, and if we want to calculate the value of compound interest, then we will need to do that as amount minus the principal. Now this is the formula to calculate the amount. But if we understand the compounding situation, if we look at this example of annual compounding, the principal was 1000, which increased by 10% at the end of 1 year, followed by another increase of 10% in the second year. So if we now go back to our concepts of percentages, this is nothing but an example of successive percentage changes. And hence another way of solving every compound interest question is by using the formula of successive percentage changes. So what we can do here is, we can say there are 2 successive changes of 10%, and if we make use of our successive percentage change formula, which was A plus B plus AB upon 100 as a percentage, we would get 10 plus 10 plus 1, and hence this kind of a compounding phenomenon would mean a 21% increase over a 2-year interval. So we can find out 21% of 1000, which will directly give us the compound interest, and if we add that to the principal of 1000, we would get the amount. So another way of solving every compound interest question is by making use of the successive percentage changes formula. Let's try and understand how to find out or how to use the difference between compound interest and simple interest in the first 2 years. We've already looked at a particular table and we built the table where we've said if the principal is 1000 rupees and the rate of interest is 10% per annum, and if we calculate the compound interest and simple interest in the first year, it happens to be the same. Simple interest in the first year was 100, compound interest in the first year also was 100. When we moved on to the second year, we saw that the simple interest was still 100, but the compound interest was 110. So this is where the difference between compound interest and simple interest comes up in the first 2 years. Now, why is there a difference between the compound interest and the simple interest in the second year? The difference comes up because we add the interest of the first year to the principal, and hence in the second year we earn an additional interest on the first year's interest. So if we want to find out the difference between compound interest and simple interest in the first 2 years, the difference is due to interest on the first year's interest. Now how do we calculate the first year's interest? It is simply R% of the principal. And if we want to find an interest on this, we will again consider R% of this, and hence this can be used as a very simple formula. Wherever you have difference between compound interest and simple interest in the first 2 years, mind you, this formula can be used only when you are looking at the difference between CI and SI in the first 2 years, and this formula is interest on the first year's interest. This is how we calculate the first year's interest, and we calculate interest on that, and this becomes equal to the difference. Now in problems it is possible that this difference is given and the rate is given and the principal is asked, or whichever way. Out of these 3 parameters, if any 2 are given, the third can be calculated. Now I have already mentioned that this formula can be used only if the problem talks about difference in the first 2 years. But there are times when the problem would talk about difference in the first 3 years. And if we have to build on the formula, it becomes a little more complicated. So let's try and understand another way of solving the same question for 2 years. If I look at simple interest, since the principal does not change, if the rate is 10% per annum, then over 2 years the simple interest return would be 20%, whereas in compounding, since we have already seen that it is an application of successive percentage changes, which means a 10% increase successively over 2 years, the return in compound interest would be 10 plus 10 plus 1, which means a 21% return. So if we look at it at the end of 2 years in percentage terms, the difference between CI and SI in the first 2 years in percentage terms is 1%. If that 1% is quantified in terms of a value, if the difference value is given to us, and then if the principal is asked, then we can straight away say that if 1% is equal to whatever is the value given, then 100% would be how much, and that will give us the value of the principal. Now if this can be used for the first 2 years, we can simply extend this using the concept of successive percentage changes for 3 years and accordingly calculate. So if it was for 3 years, then this would have become 30%, this would have become 33.1%, and then we would say if 3.1% is equal to the difference, 100% is how much. So to summarize, if the problem talks about the difference between CI and SI in the first 2 years, we can very easily use this formula, which is interest on the first year's interest. But if it is more than 2 years, then we need to use the concept of successive percentage changes, calculate the simple interest return in percentage terms, compound interest return in percentage terms, and then using this concept find out the percentage difference and equate it with the value of the difference given to us. Let's move on to a new concept, which is the difference between the compound interest in any 2 successive years. Let's understand something very basic. Compound interest in the first year would be calculated as R% of the principal. Now we've already discussed the basic concept of compound interest, which means that the interest which is calculated in the first year or the first time period gets added back to the principal, and the second time period interest is calculated on the new principal, and hence compound interest in year 2 would actually be the first year's compound interest plus R% of the first year's compound interest. This is because in the second year, you not only earn equivalent of what was earned in the first year, but you also earn interest on the first year's interest because that was added back to the principal. And hence, if we now rearrange the terms, we get compound interest of year 2 minus compound interest of year 1 is equal to R% of compound interest of year 1. And if we were to generalize this, then compound interest in any year n minus compound interest in the previous year n minus 1 would actually be R% of the compound interest of the previous year. And hence we can say that the difference between compound interest in any two successive years is R% of the compound interest of the previous year. So there are two important points that we've learned here. One is difference between compound interest in any two successive years is R% of the compound interest of the previous year, and compound interest in any year is R% more than the compound interest of the previous year, which we studied here when we looked at compound interest of year 2. Let's now look at these cases where a sum of money invested becomes an integral number of times, a certain number of times in a few years. Let's take an example where a sum of money kept at simple interest becomes 4 times in 7 years. So we've been given that there is a certain principal which becomes 4 times in 7 years, and suppose you want to find out in how many years will it become 28 times. The question is, for it to become 28 times, how many years are required? Now when we look at this example, if I say the principal is P, then the amount becomes 4 times P in 7 years. This is given to us. If the amount has become 4 times the principal, it means that the simple interest has become 3 times the principal in 7 years. Because we've already looked at a formula that amount is equal to principal plus simple interest. So simple interest becomes 3 times the principal in 7 years, and you want the amount to become 28 times, which would mean that you want the simple interest to become 27 times the principal. Now if simple interest becomes 3 times the principal in 7 years, then it will become 27 times the principal in 63 years, simply because if this gets multiplied 9 times, then this should also be multiplied by 9, and hence in such a case we see that the amount will become 28 times the principal in 63 years. Now this is one way the example can be asked, so the question can be asked. Another question that can be asked is, in such a situation where a sum of money becomes 4 times in 7 years, how much is the rate of interest? We would again go back to this statement where we say, if the sum of money has become 4 times in 7 years, then the simple interest has become 3 times the principal in 7 years. And if we use the formula of simple interest, which is PNR upon 100, we would say 3P is equal to PNR upon 100, where N can actually be replaced as 7 because we've been told it happens in 7 years. And now P cancels off and there is only one unknown R, which can very easily be calculated. So there are 2 kinds of examples which can be asked on this one single concept, which is a sum of money at simple interest becomes 4 times in 7 years. So how much is the rate of interest, or for it to become 28 times, how many years are required? We've already seen an example of a sum of money becoming 4 times in 7 years in a simple interest situation. Now let's see what happens if it's a compound interest situation. So if we say in a compound interest situation, a sum of money becomes 4 times in 7 years, So it would become 64 times in how many years is the question asked. The way we would approach this question now is, if suppose the sum of money was rupees 100, then what we are saying is after 7 years this amount would become 400. Now the concept of compounding is that the new change will be applicable on this new amount, and hence we now start with 400 and we say that this 400 in another 7 years would become 4 times, which would make it 1600, and now that 1600 in another 7 years would become 4 times, which means 6400. So if we compare these two amounts, we see that this is 64 times the initial amount, and which has happened in these 3 intervals of 7 years each, which means in 21 years the sum of money which was placed at compound interest has become 64 times. So this is the way we would tackle a question involving a compound interest scenario. Having studied the concepts of interest, and we've already looked at simple interest and compound interest, let's go back to our example of the piggy banks. We had looked at a person A and a piggy bank A, where the person started with 1 rupee, and then this person kept doubling the money every day for 10 days. Let's now try and look at this example as a principal of 1 rupee, and there is an effect of doubling every year, and this goes on for 10 years. On the other hand, there was another person B with his piggy bank having 500 rupees, and this person was adding 50 rupees every day for 10 days. So once again, if we take an annual concept, let's say he has 500 rupees and he is adding 50 rupees every year for 10 years. Now piggy bank B can be considered as an example of simple interest because the principal remains the same and there is just an increase of 10% every year for 10 years. So now in this case, where there is a simple interest applicable for piggy bank B, if I want to find the amount at the end of 10 years, then it would be principal, which was 500, into 1 plus NR upon 100, where N was 10 years and R was 10%, and hence this amount would become 1000 rupees. Let's take the case of piggy bank A, which happens to be a compounding phenomenon, because when we looked at doubling every year, there was actually an increase of 100% every year, and the new change was applicable on the final new amount every time. And hence, if we use our formula in this case, principal was 1 rupee, P into 1 plus R upon 100, rate of interest was 100%, and raised to 10 because there were 10 time periods, and hence this would become 2 raised to 10, which is 1024. So effectively we find that the person who has piggy bank A ends up with more money, and this also proves that compounding is a very, very powerful concept, and we should never get carried away by the initial amount that has been put in, which in this case was only 1 rupee, whereas here it was 500 rupees. But the powerful concept of compounding actually means that person A ends up with much more money as compared to, not much more, but still more money as compared to person B.